Let's talk to Roman Sviton, a military expert, pilot instructor, reserve colonel of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Mr. Roman, good evening. Roman, let's start with what Russian dictator Putin said. Putin threatens to hit Oreshnik on the centers of decision-making in Kyiv. The dictator said, everything in the center of the explosion will be broken into pieces, turned into saws. Putin, responding to a question about strikes on decision-making centers in Ukraine, said that today anything is possible. Is this evidence of Putin's fear, or is it a demonstration that he's scared? And how did you react to what he said today? That's right, you say. It is a terrorist attack. It was in principle any Russian attack on civilians, on infrastructure. It is a terrorist attack that fulfills the task of genocide. That is the genocide that Putin repeatedly talks about through his henchmen, is the denazification of Ukrainians, which is essentially a genocidal task, the murder of Ukrainians on the basis of nationality. Therefore, his statement today fits into the overall picture. There is nothing new here. But the fact that now Putin himself has started talking about it is probably connected with the adoption of some decisions by the International Criminal Court regarding war crimes. No one is hiding it anymore, and Putin himself is beginning to publicly articulate such actions. Either it is related to his attempt to press or engage in this topic. But in any case, he has once again confirmed his status as a terrorist leader and accordingly as a terrorist organization, the Russian Federation. That has to be taken into account, and it may be worth continuing to consider this issue of giving Russia the status of a terrorist organization or a state sponsor of terrorism, at the very least. As for the missile that we refer to as the Hazel missile, it is understandable that it can be called many different things, including derisively, as it has recently been heard in Russia. But one should not take the term too seriously. The missile itself is just a mechanism for delivering a warhead. It all depends on what kind of warhead it carries. A missile can do serious damage if its warhead is powerful enough. For example, there are cruise missiles, air-to-air missiles, ballistic missiles, and missiles of different ranges. A missile is essentially a delivery vehicle for a warhead, and the farther it can fly, the larger the target area it can cover.
Сама по себе ракета не надо серьезно относиться, потому что любая, по большому счету, ракета, она может нанести серьезный вред, все зависит от боеголовки, которую эта ракета доносит. Сама по себе ракета, по большому счету, это механизм доставки в точку удара боевой части. Разные механизмы. Есть механизмы там, крылатых ракет, самолетного типа, есть баллистические ракеты разной дальности. Это сама ракета сама по себе, чем она больше, это в основном чем дальше.
The main warheads of Russian missiles are half-ton high-explosive charges, like those of the Kaliber, Iskander, and Kinzhal.
Основных ракет российских это полутонны фугасы, то есть полутонный фугасный заряд. В основном это заряды Х-101, Х-555, калибров, Искандеров и в том числе
But if we talk about medium range, then for example, the missiles that the Russians used on the Dnieper River have a warhead that includes kinetic charges that separate into several parts. These charges can penetrate several floors, including reinforced concrete floors. 3 to 4 floors is quite realistic, and this is the main threat.
Это кинетический удар, так называемый. Они могут проламывать за счет скорости, за счет веса.
However, this problem should not be seen as a disaster. It is simply an issue that will need to be dealt with. The strike could target buried objects such as underground facilities or technological facilities. This is what such missiles are designed for.
Какой-то паники нет, это просто вопрос, с которым надо будет принимать решение. То есть удар может быть нанесен на заглубленные, то есть по заглубленным
But unless the warhead is replaced, it was originally designed to penetrate buried objects, especially in the event of a kinetic strike. But as I said, it's not a disaster. The same type of warheads that the Russians have been using for the third year are not much more dangerous than, say, half-ton landfills or even the KH-22 with a ton of explosives.
Для себя надо принимать это решение. То есть вот такая беда есть, но она, еще раз скажу, это не катастрофа ни в коем случае. Те боевые части ракет, которые россияне третий год используют по Украине, не намного опаснее.
We have seen that such missiles can destroy dozens of floors.
Пане Романе, ви абсолютно вірно наголошуєте на тому, що ми можемо по-різному називати ось цю ракету, але недооцінювати ворога не варто і
Don't underestimate the enemy.
ставитися до будь-яких загроз.
We're live on YouTube.
Є пряма трансляція на YouTube, ви можете, шановні глядачі, переходити.
You can write your comments where you're watching us from. If you have questions for Mr. Roman, you can write them. We see everything. We read everything. And thank you for your activity. We are pleased to communicate with you, and we appreciate that you are here. Firstly, and secondly, that you appreciate the Ukrainian content that we create. Also, Mr. Roman, before another statement by the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, I will quote some unpleasant things he said. Putin said that Russia was ready for talks on the condition that Ukrainian troops withdraw from 4 regions and that Ukraine would not join NATO. Ukraine, of course, will not agree to this. How would you respond to Putin?
Що неможливо і цього не буде, ми не погоджуємося на це, це абсолютно очевидно. І Путін сказав, що гарантії, що Україна не приєднається до НАТО, у разі виконання цих умов Росія негайно припинить вогонь без заморожування конфлікту, як сказав Путін. От що б ви відповіли на це російському диктатору?
Maybe I should also give him the keys to the apartment where the money is kept. But that's about it. How else can you react to it? There are things that are not up for discussion. We will not give up a single meter of our territory, so no one will definitely not take anyone anywhere. In principle, Putin's demands are already clear. They're basically coming from that situation, which he drove himself into after he brought 5 of our regions into the legal framework of the Russian Constitution. Because they also have, as we do, Article 111 for treason, and I think they have 160 for calls to change territorial integrity. After they introduced our 5 regions into their constitution, they will now be obliged to articulate these very positions everywhere. That is, from their point of view, liberation, from our point of view, capture. It is technically impossible to freeze hostilities at a front width of 1,500 kilometers when 2 armies of at least 500,000 people are standing and performing combat tasks against each other. At one time, Poroshenko and Merkel tried to disperse troops on a 400-kilometer front in the Donetsk region. That was in 2014, 2015, and beyond. There were 30,000 people on both sides there, stretched over 400 kilometers of front, but no one succeeded. Everyone remembers the attempts to separate the troops in the area of Zolotoye or in the area of the same Kalmius. It is unrealistic. It is technically impossible. But Putin's attempts to freeze the hostilities, to freeze the attempts themselves, will definitely happen. Now they will try to convey this through Putin's talking heads, explaining why this is necessary. In order to ensure Putin any freeze, but again, not a withdrawal of troops, but a freeze is a reduction in the intensity of hostilities, which he needs in order to rebuild the army and put out more ammunition, because he is now working from the wheels. To restore the army, that is, to complete the troops, and in order to continue in the next summer campaign, to fulfill the task that he said, and the attempt to extrude our troops outside the Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions. Everything is spelled out in the Constitution.
Там все прописано в Конституции, потому стратегические планы путинские, это понятно. Не отказ от вступления в НАТО, он тоже технически Украиной невозможен.
Therefore, Putin's strategic plans are clear. The refusal to join NATO is written into our Constitution. To get it out of the Constitution, it is unrealistic because it is simply impossible to pass 2 sessions exactly, and a referendum, among other things, must also be held by and large. That is, these are technically impossible things. That is why everything Putin says, he either does not work out the technical implementation, or it is one of the mechanisms of his defense reaction, so-called. Because Putin is hysterical, and at this point it's obvious that Putin is hysterical because the next year ahead is going to be very tough for the Russian economy. But if you don't count the failure, the internal turmoil has already begun, which will eventually lead to the Russian economy collapsing, and there will be nothing to recruit with, nothing to buy North Korean soldiers, equipment, and ammunition with. Putin doesn't take into account that sanctions will put pressure on the Russian and near-Russian economy, which will affect the oligarchs who feed off the war. The pressure on their wallets becomes a serious problem. Mr. Roman, recently the GUR destroyed the Russian Podlyot radar in Crimea, which cost about $5 million. This station was able to detect and track aircraft, helicopters, and missiles at low altitudes, including stealth. Its destruction complicates the situation for the occupiers.
Здатна виявляти, супроводжувати літаки, вертольоти, крилаті ракети і на малих, і гранично малих висотах, навіть тих, які виготовлені за технологією стелс. Знищення ось такої
Such radars are the eyes of the Russian air defense system, i.e. they are mainly observation radars, so-called. They provide information about the presence of targets at a certain range, altitude, and altitude. This is low, extremely low altitude, so they can practically see, including airplanes and missiles flying near the ground. Helicopters, of course, but not far away. That's why you need to install a lot of such stations. The point is that horizon control at long distances is practically impossible. The higher the station is raised, the greater its range, because the mast of this station raises the locator as much as possible to see beyond the horizon. However, the radio horizon cannot be overcome. At least it is impossible to accurately detect a flying target over the horizon. This, in fact, is the task of these stations. They extend several tens of meters, which gives them a fairly decent range, but they need to be installed a lot, and they are expensive. The element base is not produced in Russia, it is purchased, and with the imposition of serious sanctions, this becomes an almost irretrievable loss for Russians. If this network of stations were destroyed, the Russians would lose about 30% of their ability to track targets and transmit information for use by anti-aircraft systems or aircraft. This is a serious blow to Russia. The GSD is correct in establishing preliminary air superiority, followed by our long-range attacks.
Естественно, пойдут наши атаки средствами, дальними средствами поражения, ракетами баллистическими, крылатыми, беспилотниками.
Or maybe by air, depending on the enemy's air defense density. Mr. Roman, about today's attack by the Russian occupiers. During the Russian missile attack on the territory of Ukraine, 12 hits were recorded, mainly at the country's fuel and energy sector facilities. The command of the Air Force of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reported that electrical substations in various regions were under attack.
електричні підстанції в різних областях, і протиповітряна оборона в даному випадку...
Air defenses shot down almost 90% of Caliber and X-101 missiles, 3 guided missiles, and 35 drones. More than 60 UAVs were destroyed. Do you think Russia is changing its shelling tactics? And was this massive shelling a response to the strikes on Russia, as Putin said? Obviously, even without our strikes on Russia,
як сказав російський терорист Путін, хоча тут очевидно, що в будь-якому випадку, навіть якщо б ми не завдавали ударів по території Росії,
these attacks by Russia on Ukrainian territory would have continued.
З боку Росії по території України вони б і надалі продовжувалися.
The military concept of ping-pong does not exist. That is, there is a certain amount of combat training that results in hitting the enemy's military targets. The military does not have such a concept. Politicians do. And sometimes they raise questions about retaliatory strikes, saying, we'll hit you and you'll hit us. If we go there, you go there. But this does not apply to the military. The Russian military, by the way, is also among them. That is, there is a certain combat training plan. There is a plan to destroy specific targets that are agreed upon. And then according to this plan, work is carried out. Preparations for such an attack would, at the very least, take more than a week. Of course, our strikes on Russian military facilities on Russian territory cannot be a reason for launching such an attack.
Естественно, никак не попадают там наши удары, допустим, по российским военным объектам на территории России под причину нанесения такого рода атак. То есть,
let's say that the attack by the same Kokoshnik or Oreshnik was prepared for several months. That's at least because it was necessary to prepare the missile. And moreover, it was produced. These are single copies, and at least it has not yet become serial, no matter what Putin says. It is still pre-production. That is, it is undergoing certain tests. You can see that, by the way, the missile is crude in this sense. The long process of preparing large-scale missile strikes has nothing to do with our actions. We have our own actions. That is, we also prepare attacks that are carried out by our aviation, our missilers, and the armed forces of Ukraine. A combined attack is not something that can be prepared in 3 days. You have to prepare for it too. Sometimes it takes a week or more. This is more political ping-pong, which can be used by politicians, but not by the military, because they are engaged in combat tasks, not ping-pong. The attack carried out by the Russians today was really a large-scale, combined attack. Calibras were used. There was an understanding of the processes. They approached the task with an attempt to destroy our western regions, because most of the missiles and drones were moving westward, realizing that there is less air defense density there. However, most of the missiles and drones were intercepted at the entrance, in and around the Dnieper River, several dozen kilometers from the border. Most of the missiles did not make it to the west, and those that did get through fulfilled their combat mission. Indeed, more than a dozen missiles hit energy facilities, and the task was again genocidal, terrorist, an attempt to destroy the life support infrastructure of the Ukrainian nation. There were hits, but the hit rate is now quite high, around 90%. If before it was somewhere around 75 to 85%, now we're talking about raising it to 90%. This has become possible thanks to the proper configuration of our air defense forces, the increased density of air defense. There is, of course, a feeling of a shortage of missiles, and we need to work with our partners on this issue, because for us, it is a consumable item. The Russians have sent almost 200 targets, and we need enough missiles to minimize them as much as possible. Aviation was also engaged in its own sectors, and this is the right approach, since there are already sectoral mechanisms for destroying Russian weapons of mass destruction in order to avoid coming under so-called friendly fire. The mobile groups worked well, although the weather did not allow us to maximize the use of their capabilities. But the guys, of course, are professionals. Well done. They worked well throughout the country. Thus, the Russian attack failed. Our air defense is at its best. However, those missiles that got through, there will always be. The fact is that there is no 100% air defense system that would shoot down everything. The part of the missiles that get through raises the question for our authorities of preparing additional defense mechanisms, since some of them will get through. This means that we need to strengthen our defenses. Money was allocated at the beginning of the year, but we have yet to see results, at least on those passing missiles that do seriously damage our energy supply system.
Определенных механизмов защиты уже, потому что часть однозначно будет проходить. Значит, надо усиливать. Деньги выделены были в начале года, а что-то не видно то есть не видно отдачи, по крайней мере. Проходящие ракеты все-таки наносят серьезное поражение.
It's not so much about generating energy as it is about transmitting it. These are power lines, transformers. Today, the Russians used calibras with cluster warheads to inflict maximum damage to the very mechanisms responsible for power transmission. Mr. Roman, I would like to discuss air defense systems further and emphasize that the Minister of Defense of the Netherlands has announced the transfer of 3 Patriot anti-aircraft missile launchers to Ukraine. Additional air defense systems are needed to protect civilians and critical infrastructure. How significant is this reinforcement? You have already said that we need missiles to shoot down anything flying towards Ukraine. How are we currently prepared for winter, given the public data and statements by governments?
Спираючись на ті публічні офіційні дані, які вже відомі з ЗМІ і від офіційних осіб конкретних держав.
Everything must be understood. What Putin may use and the degree of readiness naturally depends on this. If the same means of destruction are used as before, in the same quantities, we can say that our preparation is satisfactory. The density of air defense is satisfactory at the moment. Of course, it is still far from ideal, but indicators such as today's, about 90%, are already quite good. However, if Putin starts using, for example, medium-range missiles or intercontinental ballistic missiles, we currently have almost nothing to intercept them. We can try to intercept the separated warheads of these missiles, but that would be a real problem.
Попытаться, по крайней мере, Патриот перехватить уже разделившиеся боеголовки российские этих ракет, но это будет проблема. А если еще под вопросом, а если, допустим, будут...
If long-range missiles are used, even if they have the same warheads, we have no mechanism to intercept them, and we do not have the necessary missile systems, such as TT-T3 or Strela-3. These are different names for the same missile. It would be optimal to assume that Putin can use the full range of ballistic missiles, all the means of defeat that he has. This means that we need to request an air defense system similar to the one used by NATO. It is important to request such a defense system as NATO has, because it will be a big plus for European countries. If they know that there are launchers of this system, such as the Aegis system, on our territory, they will feel much calmer. Aegis launchers located on the ground can be the basis for the Mk-41 launchers, which are used on ships and can contain 64 launch silos. These silos can work not only with Tomahawk missiles, but also with other means. This two-in-one approach will be extremely useful for us. This needs to be brought up to our partners and offered to them. It is not only important for us to have such a defense, but also for Europe. The closer air defense launchers and locators are located to Russian launchers, the calmer Europe will be. The further east the interceptor missiles are launched, the more confident Europe will sleep. Mr. Roman, you also mentioned aviation. Today I saw a report that the issue of transferring Polish MiG-29 fighters to Ukraine is still on the agenda, and consultations with NATO are underway to strengthen the alliance's presence in Polish airspace.
щодо посилення присутності альянсу.
This was announced by the spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Oreshnik. In your opinion, how realistic is the transfer of Polish MiG-29s to Ukraine? This is not the first time we have discussed this topic, so what do you think about it now?
І от що думаєте ви на даний момент?
Ну, поляки не будут, допустим, даже как бы они там к нам хорошо не относились, ради нас не будут оголять свое воздушное пространство, тем более у них есть
The Poles, despite good relations with us, will not bare their airspace for us, given their common borders with Russia and Belarus, and their participation in the defense of the Baltic states. If the planes are built into the air defense system, they will not be handed over without replacement.
Естественно, нам их никто не передаст так сходу, как бы мы их ни просили. Должно быть определенное замещение. Вот эти механизмы замещения.
This includes overlapping some sectors with other NATO members, at least, or the Americans could also address this issue with supplies. Additional planes from their bases. This is a technical issue that is being resolved, but it has not been resolved yet. In any case, we will definitely get the MiR-29. The only question is when. The sooner the better. The Poles, if they get the F-35, will simply not need these MiR-29s and will give them to us, as the Scandinavian countries have already done with the F-16s. The Poles will give us the MiG-29, and there is another mechanism for the delivery of South Korean T-50s. They have already received a squadron and paid for 48 aircraft, 12 of which have been delivered. $3 billion has been paid. I think this moment can also play a positive role for us, as we may be able to get additional squadrons, which will allow the Poles to accept T-50s on South Korean aircraft and speed up the decision to transfer the MiG-29. For now, NATO has put the issue of the MiG-29 transfer on hold, according to Defense Express, following a statement by the Chief of the General Staff of the Netherlands Armed Forces, who told Break in Defense that we should avoid transferring a large number of systems to Ukraine because there are not enough pilots to operate them. What is our current situation with pilots? And do you agree that the dispersion of resources and the need to support several similar systems instead of...
Поки що поставили на паузу в НАТО, нібито такого висновку дійшли в Defense Express після заяви начальника Генштабу Збройних сил Нідерландів в виданню Breaking Defense. І начальник Генштабу зазначив, що нам варто уникати передачі Україні дуже великої кількості систем, тому що у них не вистачає пілотів.
Concentrating on one type does not make sense? Or does it make sense and why? If there is an opportunity to put one airplane of the same type, it is definitely better to fixate on it. The question is whether there is such an opportunity.
Если есть возможность поставить один самолет, то есть однотипный, однозначно лучше, конечно, на него и зацикливаться. Вопрос в этом, есть ли такая возможность. То есть нам перед носом в свое время морковкой F-16 поводили.
We were offered F-16s at one time, almost taking us away from making a decision on Gripen, Mirage, Eurofighter, as well as on South Korean T-50s, showing the possibility of supplying F-16s. Indeed, several thousand of them have been produced. Such a possibility exists, but the question is in the technical transfer. This is where the so-called ping-pong began. Until Biden, which is basically his administration, gave us the planes. It was the Biden administration, it was the Obama administration, and their decisions had a big impact on our strategy. It's not the F-16 handover. They got us started on that, and then they just didn't give us the planes. And the planes that they did give us were not sufficiently armed. JASM we still haven't seen, and they are not being used to the extent that they could be. If you look at it from that perspective, we need, if the F-16s aren't given, about 200 airplanes. We have them, we can theoretically get them, but technically, as long as Biden is in charge of the situation, it's unclear how Trump will look at it. We may not get them in sufficient numbers at all. In this case, we should go the second way. Collect everything possible, aircraft mechanisms, the Gripen, the Mirage, and everything that can be bought on the world market. This issue should be raised because the best option for us is becoming unavailable, and the Americans are slowing down this process. We have been with them on this issue for 2 years now. They have been leading us by the thread, but they give us practically nothing. Therefore, we need to realize that we will not get enough F-16s, and we need to address the issues of all other aircraft. We have a sufficient number of pilots. The question is how to attract and motivate them to carry out combat missions. This is a separate, voluminous topic. Previously, every year we graduated about 500 pilots from 2 flight schools, Chernihiv and Kharkiv. Those pilots didn't go anywhere. They were just misused. Some of our Air Force leaders did not know that such pilots existed, and they were used as tankers, artillerymen, and mortarmen. Airmen continue to be used for these tasks, and with the right approach and proper planning, it is possible to find pilots who can master various types of aircraft, such as the Mirage and Gripen. The Mirage, for example, is the same MiG-21 I was still flying in the 80s. It's not a problem to retrain on such an airplane.
С правильным подходом, грамотным, найдутся летчики, которые смогут летать на определенных типах самолетов. На Мираже, Мираж это тот же МиГ-21.
The Gripen is also quite easy to fly. So, with the right approach, the right personnel for these planes will be found. The fact that there are no pilots who can fly these airplanes now is an issue that Biden should have addressed 2 years ago when he started training the flight crews. If that had been done, we would not now have the problem of our pilots working in other roles, but flying the same Gripen or Mirage.
Самолетах летать. Так это же как раз вот вопрос к Байдену. 2 года назад надо было начинать переучивать летный состав. Сейчас бы у нас обратный процесс был. У нас бы летчики не танкистами работали, вернее, выполняли боевые задачи, а летали на тех же Грипенах или Миражах.
I think that for another 2 months, until Biden leaves, this Kotavasia, the so-called ping pong, will continue. And after January 21st, it will be possible perhaps to start relations with the Americans with a clean slate. Mr. Roman, let's talk about the F-16 briefly. A month ago, Michael Boehnert, an expert on air warfare, commented to Business Insider that the shortened training period on the U.S. F-16 fighter jets, combined with the need to radically change piloting tactics, has become a huge challenge for Ukrainian pilots and an additional risk in future extreme situations on the battlefield. In your opinion, to what extent does this shortened training period affect the situation, and what exactly? According to the expert, the radically new skills that Ukrainian pilots had to learn too quickly make it difficult to overcome old habits and muscle memory, in particular.
Ну, мышечная память, понятно. Мы все летали на самолетах, оборудованных РУС, так называемый, рычаг или ручка управления самолетом.
Muscle memory is important when transitioning from one airplane to another. We flew airplanes with Russian control systems, and the F-16 is joystick-controlled like most European airplanes, including the Gripen. The issue of muscle memory is solved by the number of flights. The more a pilot flies a new machine, the faster the memory switches.
на самолете. То есть, чем больше летчик налетывает на новом самолете, тем мышечная память, естественно,
Training is one
переключается.
thing,
Здесь
and
очень
retraining
самолет.
is a completely different thing.
Вопрос
Training takes time.
переучивания
It cannot
или
be compressed.
обучения — это
A
немножко
pilot
другая
has to learn
история.
how to perform
Обучение
combat
действительно,
missions,
оно
which takes a
быстрее,
minimum of
очень
3 to 4
устойчиво.
years.
Обучаться
It takes 5 to 7 years on
обучаться
average to
выполнению
achieve
боевых
first and
задач, ну,
second class
3-4 года это
qualification.
минимум.
Retraining, on the other
Для
hand, is
уровня
much faster.
второго класса где-то 5-7 лет. А вот переучивание — это все намного проще. Реально, допустим, переучить летчика на однотипный примерно самолет.
For example, it takes 3 to 4 months to retrain a pilot to fly an airplane similar in type. I've done it myself. I've retrained a whole regiment. It's no problem. If the airplanes are very different in type, retraining can take 6 months or a little more, but it's still not a difficult task, especially if the tasks are simplified. For the F-16, the tasks the pilot will be doing will be different too. There will be no aerial combat, as long-range missiles will keep the planes from getting close to each other. Therefore, missions will be limited to dealing with avionics and long-range weapons, such as missiles. If the F-16 is to be used as an interceptor fighter, the tasks will be related to intercepting air targets. For ground operations, attack aircraft and bombers, such as the Su-24 and Su-25, would be better utilized. However, a fighter pilot is also multifunctional and can perform missions against both air and ground targets. There are problems in this process, but they are not global, and they are being solved. Everything depends on motivation of pilots and proper selection, as well as willingness to learn languages.
Перехватчика, истребителя выполнять задачи перехвата и уничтожения российских летательных аппаратов разного уровня. То есть, по большому счету, здесь зависит, наверное, нельзя, то есть, точечно говорить о каких-то проблемах.
This is a process that needs to be started if we see a prospect. If there is little prospect of F-16 delivery, we need to work with other types of aircraft, such as the Gripen or South Korean T-50s.
Начинать, если видеть перспективу. Если мы не видим перспективы поставки F-16, смысла о ней говорить. Ну, то есть, а если есть возможность, допустим, работать с другими типами самолетов, начиная от Гриппенов, заканчивая южнокорейскими Т-50, так с ними надо начинать.
We need to start that work, because in the future you still have to choose one or more types of aircraft. The F-16 would be ideal if it were in sufficient numbers, but that doesn't look like it's going to happen. Not under Biden and probably not under Trump.
Но его, я так понимаю, не будет. Не будет ни при Байдене, и вряд ли это будет при том же Трампе. А дальше Трамп 4 года побудет, следующий кто-то придет, допустим, там тоже это на кого-то...
Even if Trump stays for another 4 years, it may be too risky to wait for a decision from the U.S. The optimal option would be to work with European manufacturers, with European firms. The choice here is not so great. It's either Eurofighter or Swedish Gripen. French Mirage are not suitable either, as they are now just starting to retrain their pilots for the new aircraft.
Даже Мираж не попадает. Это если с французами говорить, то тоже надо новый самолет французский. Они сейчас только переучиваются, тоже там сильно много нам не светит. Потому Eurofighter и Gripen.
Mr. Roman, the information that comes from Zelensky. He noted that Putin is trying to escalate the situation by using his arsenal to thwart Trump's post-inauguration efforts. And the second thing is what we mentioned, Mr. Roman. Last night, Russia launched a Caliber with a cluster warhead, which is a particularly dangerous weapon for civilians. We ask you to respond to the air raid alert and take care of yourself and your loved ones. Thank you, Mr. Roman, for your expert opinion. Roman Svitan, a military expert and retired colonel, was with us.
Нагадаю, що Роман Світан, військовий експерт, льотчик-інструктор, полковник запасу української армії, був з нами на прямому зв'язку. Ми нашим глядачам кажемо...
We say goodbye to our viewers. We will see you again tomorrow at 19:10. We would like to remind you that you can write your comments and ask questions to Mr. Roman. We see everything, read everything, and thank you for your activity. So we will see you tomorrow and see you